This week on Talking Politics USA, has Trump and Zelensky's Vatican meeting changed anything for Ukraine?
If the objective is simply to ensure a ceasefire and have a sort of Korean Peninsula style sort of frozen front line, then maybe that is the only way forward.
After a frantic start, what will the next 100 days of Trump bring?
It's going to get real for the Trump administration.
That is going to be potentially the story of the next 100 days.
And Dan's in Canada for an election where the US president could prove pivotal.
And they're going to vote for the Liberals for the sake of sort of Canadian sovereignty and unity, and that's become the overwhelming theme.
Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Politics USA. I'm Tom Bradby and I'm very pleased to say I'm joined today by an all-star cast. Our correspondent Robert Moore in Washington, former White House advisor Laura Schwartz in Chicago, and our US correspondent Dan Rivers, who is in the Canadian capital, Ottawa, for that enormously important election there. And just to kick off, some hot news for you as we record this. You can now, should you so wish, buy a new MAGA cap that says Trump 2028. There are t-shirts to go with it, and on the t-shirts they say rewriting the rules, which perhaps says it all. Laura, let's start with you. Will you be buying a cap? Is this, what do you make of this? Is it sort of performative, trying to wind liberals up, or is there a serious intent behind it?
Well, I think Trump takes every opportunity to wind liberals up for sure. And this is a great way to do it. You know, they say that they're in high demand, so I think my order is going to take a couple of weeks. So I'm not ready to debut it today. I think that it's something that he tosses out there on purpose. And some days he says, oh, it's something that people are looking into, or, oh, I wouldn't really do that. I mean, he loves toying with it. He loves keeping us on the edge of our seats. So, of course, this hat is going to sell out. Steve Bannon, one of his big advisors of the past, is really trying to push this opportunity for him. They've got Eric Trump, his son, wearing the hat on the website. As kind of offhanded this is, and it's going to get a lot of late night jokes, it's also something that people are very serious about around him. So we'll see. There is this 22nd Amendment in our country's Constitution that says he can't, but I think he's going to try everything that he can to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea that there's been this kind of suggestion that that maybe he'll run as J.D. Vance's running mate, and then J.D. Vance would resign, enabling Donald Trump to become president again, supposedly legally. I noticed some of the other hats that have been around say Trump 45-47, and you know, I suppose you could interpret that he, in his mind, he was also 46 as well, but he just didn't. He felt he won that election and was never confirmed. So. Yeah, this is another one to add to the collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think not only is there Trump 28 hats, I think there is also now, in this outstanding bit of trolling, there's also Trump 32, even Trump 36 hats available. So I think that gives you the sense that this is kind of a joke on liberals. It is conceivable, but it requires a changing of the Constitution, as Laura alluded to. That requires, a 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress. It requires then a 3/4 majority of state legislatures to sign as well. So look, changing the Constitution is a massive uphill climb. And therefore, I think we can actually dismiss it. Though I was on a radio talk show a few days ago down in Louisiana, and there was a guy who called in and said, look, as Dan alluded to, he won in 2020, it wasn't allowed by liberals in his view, and therefore he was cheated of a term, and therefore it should be owed to him in 2028. So look, there is that MAGA base out there, but clearly in my mind, this is outstanding right-wing trolling of the left.
Well, let's get into the first 100 days, which we are nearly at. And before we do, I'm sure there's nothing about the last slightly less than 100 days you will have forgotten, but just in case you have, here's a reminder.
The golden age of America begins right now. We are going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Tonight, I'm going to be signing on the J6 hostages, pardons.
I think that it's a big mistake to allow people, the Palestinians or
the people living in Gaza to go back yet another time. And we don't want Hamas going back. And think of it as a big real estate site. And the United States is going to own it.
Donald is coming to set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright.
You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
And I said, can we send out an email to everyone just saying, what did you get done last week? The president said yes, so it did that.
The judge's ruling, upholding our decision to deny the Associated Press such privileged access, reinforces the truth.
Canada should honestly become our 51st state. I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my They are dying to make a deal. Please, please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir.
Okay, well, there we are. Why don't I kick off by just, we've been sitting here in the UK. Almost every single edition of News at 10, our flagship show, is dominated by Trump. Maybe not quite, but pretty much every one. And I suppose, of course, people in Britain don't all have one view. But I thought I'd kind of maybe have a very quick rundown of how I suspect the majority of voters people probably see it in the UK, and then ask you to sort of take it away with what you'd pick out and what you would add. From our perspective here, I think, looking at it, the first thing is it's been incredibly upsetting and alienating for many people to see our most important ally behaving in a way that I think a lot of British people can't understand. Quite often, quite insulting to Europeans. Sometimes it appears to Brits, with J.D. Vance's kind of random nations who haven't fought a war comment. I think people took great offense to that. People took great offense to the Zelensky-Trump argument in the White House. I don't think we could understand that. I think there's the sense that America has become very isolationist. Perhaps it always has been to a degree, but much more so. And it's quite hard to see why that is even in America's interest, let alone the rest of the democratic world. I think we can't understand his trade policy. What's he trying to achieve? It just seems utterly chaotic, and he seems to be trashing America's reputation as a safe haven with potentially very long-term implications for America in the world. On the other side of the coin, I think there's lots of people in Britain who feel that immigration is not taken seriously here. There are clearly a lot of people in America who don't feel it's taken seriously. I think people probably do think, well, he's at least trying to get something done, though I'm interested to hear what you all would think about how transgressive of the legal process it has become. So I think in sum, a lot of people in Britain would just say this is very confusing. It seems very chaotic, and it's not really clear what he's trying to achieve in any area, except possibly, Israel, Gaza. He seems to have entirely taken Israel's view. In Ukraine, I think people do at least see that he's trying to achieve peace there, albeit that most people here, I think, find him distressingly more inclined to see the Russian side of it. But Laura, maybe you go first. What would you pick out, and how would you assess the first 100 days?
Well, it's really interesting what you mentioned off the bat about America and its allies, and really the dismantling of these relationships. I was going to say, kind of like my top 3 things on my bingo card for the first 100 days. One thing that kind of surprised me about it, and there's not many surprises, because Trump's doing everything that he outlined on the campaign trail that Project 2025 had mentioned. But he's just been incredibly emboldened. Even when the markets tanked after Liberation Day, it took a lot to get him to say, let's do a 90-day pause. He doesn't seem to be beholden to the same standards, especially economically, as he was during Trump 1.0. And it's kind of making sense now, because The Atlantic, a very well-respected magazine here in the United States, just this morning came out with an article of which they sat down for 2 interviews and did one by phone with President Trump. And in the transcript, they quote him as saying, the first time, referring to his first term, I had 2 things to do: run the country and survive. And the second time, I run the country and the world. So I think that is really a stark statement that speaks to how emboldened he is, which comes to the next thing within the 100 days that I've been really just very very sad about is that the unchecked brazen power that he's conducted, not just with executive orders, but his approach to educational institutions, cultural institutions, the judiciary system, bucking the justices' decisions. I think that really it's just been without barriers that he now almost thinks he's got carte blanche, and right now the Republicans are giving it to him, and the Democrats just don't have what it takes yet to stop him.
Yeah, I think I pick up on that, Laura. I mean, you know, he did win all the 7 swing states, and so I suppose legitimately from his point of view, say he had a mandate and he's enacting the mandate. As you said, a lot of the things that he is doing were set out in that Project 2025 document by the Heritage Foundation. But there's a whole load of other things that haven't been in that stood out to me in the first 100 days. I mean, it has been a roller coaster of the first 3 or so months. I mean, that row with Zelensky in the Oval Office was astonishing. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that on the kind of international stage, you know, sort of lecturing almost sort of to the point where you wondered if they were going to start trading blows at some point. And then the tariffs as well with you know, the so-called Liberation Day on April the 2nd, this, you know, sort of very dramatic almost reality TV style, you know, bringing out the big chart of, you know, the winners and the losers, or in this case, really the losers and the even bigger losers. Again, another classic bit of Trump theatre designed to kind of dominate the news agenda and the news cycle, but also, as you say, sort of projecting his will on the rest of the world, really, and it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out. And then we've had, you know, his involvement with Gaza, with Ukraine, and that's before we talk about the kind of constitutional crisis that is unfolding with his you know, pretty kind of flagrant disregard for the opinions of federal judges and so on when it comes to immigration. So it has been an extraordinary first 100 days. Any one of those stories on their own, the dismantling of entire departments of the federal government, for example, would have been a huge dominating story. But it feels like there's been one of these almost every week.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too contrarian and recognizing, you know, Laura's and Dan's smart points, but I do wonder if sort of 100 days is sort of premature to make a judgment. You know, Tom, you and I will remember when we were teenagers how, you know, in the early days of the Ronald Reagan presidency, in fact, throughout much of those 8 years, you know, he was widely seen in Europe and in Britain as, you know, almost a comical figure, a wildly controversial as well, and unpredictable. And therefore, you know, to try and avoid groupthink, I sometimes do a thought experiment. I sort of ask myself, well, suppose there is a ceasefire in Ukraine that is sustainable. I suppose these very low migration rates on the southern border are sustained. Suppose he does strike trade deals with Japan, India, South Korea, and then Britain and the EU, and then suddenly sort of AI improvements and productivity developments kick back into the US economy. Perhaps we would reevaluate Trump differently at the end of 1 or 2 years. So, you know, I think it's important to try and avoid the sort of groupthink that everything Trump does is sort of nonsensical. So I would say that, you know, this is a premature point to try and judge the Trump second term, you know, even though it is, as you point out, Tom, anathema to many in Britain. Nevertheless, I don't rule out the chance that he might sort of improve his approval rating over the next year. We'll have to wait to see. But in terms of what was the most striking moment for me, it was just like hours after his inauguration and the release of those January the 6th prisoners or hostages, as he calls them. That for me was a real sign, almost immediately after the inauguration, that this was going to be Trump unrestrained, nothing like the first Trump term.
And, you know, on that, Robert, I think that's something I learned most in this first 100 days. You're right. It's just a snapshot. There's about 1,300 left to go. But I think it's just shown us a behavioral pattern. And Dan, what you're talking about, his performative art, whether it's in the Oval Office or aboard Air Force One or anywhere he goes, he craves that. But I think it's this behavioral pattern that he's setting out, that he's above the law, that he is going at it and running the country and the world. That's what I'm going to look to see if that really continues further down. But I think there's a pattern here that I think reveals itself more than anything else.
I wonder if one way to look at him in a way is to say, okay, he has a higher chance of succeeding where unpredictability may be an advantage and a lower chance of succeeding where unpredictability causes a great deal of difficulty. So, for example, on the American economy and the international economy, almost everyone, business leaders, CEOs, Wall Street, pretty much anyone who is a decision maker in business already hates all the uncertainty. You know, what's next? Are tariffs on? Are tariffs off? Are trade deals on? Are trade deals off? What's coming down the track? It's very hard to make an investment decision. On the other hand, you could make the argument, and I'd love to talk about it now, that the Ukraine-Russia war, Dan, you've been there on the front line, seen terrible things. And so maybe you go first in answer to this, but it has been grinding on. It's almost at a total stalemate as far as we can gather. So having a president who comes in, who is unpredictable, who no one quite knows which way he might go on it, albeit that he's sounded much more pro-Russian than anyone before him. I mean, is that a potential? And I thought it was so startling, that picture from the Pope's funeral. I mean, everything about it, the intensity, obviously the Vatican staff who put that together had something in mind. The idea of Pope Francis as as somebody who was more interested in building bridges, not walls. The whole thing was so symbolic to me. And I found myself coming into the start of this weekend thinking, okay, well, look, could we be on the cusp of something here? I mean, Dan, what do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that something has to change in Ukraine, doesn't it? I mean, the situation on the front line, we don't really. It's sort of fallen out of the headlines in a way. Not Ukraine, but the awful toll that is being inflicted on the soldiers, the young men on both sides who are being killed in their thousands. And it's something that Donald Trump mentions time and time again. And I think no matter what you think of the way he's trying to deal with Ukraine, I think a lot of people will have some sympathy with the idea that this is almost like a sort of First World War trench warfare situation that is just appalling, and something has to be done. Now, obviously, the manner in which he's doing it is highly controversial, but maybe, as you suggest, Tom, that is what is needed to break the deadlock. And that chat in the Vatican was fascinating, with suggestions that Zelensky might be willing to compromise, perhaps on Ukraine. Highly controversial, possibly unconstitutional in Ukraine, but something has got to be done to break that deadlock. Gosh, yeah. I mean, if we get, as Robert suggested, if we get to the end of this year and there has been a peace deal, even if it does reward Russia for that aggression, maybe history will judge him much more kindly, that he was willing to take huge political risks and alienate a lot of his traditional allies in Europe in order to stop the killing. But this war has dragged on for three long years now, and the effect on the Ukrainian people is just immeasurable. And obviously something it has to end at some point, and the sooner the better from their point of view.
We just heard this morning that Putin will do a 3-day ceasefire starting May 9th. So far what he's done in regards to ceasefire, even on Easter, has been clearly performative, and the bombings continue. So you can never trust. You can get to the point where you don't trust but verify. But right now, a lot of Americans, they're glad that there are talks going on directly with Russia. Now, during the Biden administration, they said that there were talks behind the scenes, and with different level officials, not Putin himself, and that what they did, creating the leverage towards the end of the administration, was something that the new administration could take up the mantle on. And that's something I think should be completely nonpartisan. Take the mantle up, have these conversations. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how much and at what length it would be politically damaging for Donald Trump to have the U.S. recognize that Russian owns Crimea because he just doesn't have any political boundaries, regardless whether or not the 2028 talk is real. He's a lamed up president for all intents and purposes. Whatever he does now, it's not going to damage himself because he's not going to run again, theoretically. And I think that emboldens him again to make a deal that maybe is something that we couldn't stomach a few years ago. But after seeing all the death and destruction, Americans, want this over with. And there's a lot of treasure being sent overseas when now economically we're really feeling a lot of tightening here.
Robert, can I just ask you for the historical perspective? We've talked before on this podcast. When I joined ITN as a trainee 35 years ago, you were already our Moscow correspondent. And I can remember my earliest days here were watching you nightly talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for anyone listening to this who doesn't remember that era, it's quite hard to capture just what an extraordinary epoch-shattering feeling it was to be around. We always thought the Cold War would go on forever, the Iron Curtain would be there forever, and there were you nightly reporting on it collapsing in front of us. So I'm kind of fascinated to know what your perspective is, particularly about some of the concessions spoken of, like returning Crimea to Russia and America actually recognizing that. Do you feel like that's a historically terrible decision because it, recognizes one nation just grabbing land from the other, or do you view it in a very different context?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tom, and I think about it quite a bit. I mean, in terms of the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union and the sort of emotional trauma that did to the Russian sort of elite, and not least to a young Vladimir Putin. In my view, look, talking to Moscow is always better than not talking to Moscow. We cannot escape its kind of geopolitical importance. We cannot kind of avoid the reality that it's got, one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, the second largest of all, and that it's a vast country, spanning from the Baltics to the Pacific Ocean. So, I think Trump sort of breaking the taboo and talking to Moscow is essentially a smart move. And I don't know any foreign policy analyst, at least who in his realistic moments believes that Crimea will ever become Ukrainian. So the question becomes, has actually Donald Trump done us something of a favor breaking that taboo about, never accepting Crimea should be part of Ukraine? And, does that actually sort of reset negotiations? Because realistically, even if Putin fell, even if there was regime change in Moscow in some extraordinary sort of turn of events, there is no Russian leader who is likely to concede Crimea. So, and there's nobody who believes that that Ukraine has the military prowess or the ability to actually take it back by force. So, maybe, and this is the great sort of controversy about Donald Trump, is he kind of accepting reality? Is he ultimately a foreign policy realist, a pragmatist, and accepting sort of the realities on the ground? And perhaps is he therefore setting negotiations on a path to success? Now, lots of people would say, look, that's an outrageous course for Trump to chart because it's rewarding aggression. But if the objective is simply to ensure a ceasefire and have a sort of Korean Peninsula style sort of frozen front line, then maybe that is the only way forward.
Speaking of foreign policy realism or not, one of the things I think British people have found most baffling is the whole Canada as the 51st state thing. Doesn't seem to make any sense, I think, to people here. And all it seems to have achieved is to have had, somebody he doesn't like as a politician shoot up from many points, 20 plus points behind in the polls to potentially winning this election. In the form of Mark Carney. Now, Dan, you were there. Let's start with you, and then Laura, you and Robert maybe pick up. I mean, where are we on this? Is Mark Carney going to win in your view, and what impact will that have?
Well, the polls suggest he's ahead. They have tightened, but at the moment, it's about sort of 43% to Mark Carney's Liberal Party versus the Conservatives of Pierre Poilievre on about 38. So that would suggest that Carney is going to manage to pull off this incredible political comeback, as you say, from being, when Trudeau had just left at -20, I think, behind the Conservatives to a handful of points ahead. It's interesting, this morning, Donald Trump has again weighed in on this, and without naming Poilievre, he's basically sort of thrown his weight behind him, saying, calling on Canadians to elect a man who has the strength and wisdom to cut taxes in half, clearly, a nod to endorsing Poilievre, and again, saying Canada should be the 51st state, effectively. I think all that's going to do is to harden the resolve of Canadians. Many, traditional Conservatives here have decided this is an exceptional election, and they're going to vote for the Liberals for the sake of sort of Canadian sovereignty and unity, and that's become the overwhelming theme of this election. So you can see the Parliament behind me there, that tall tower behind me is part of the Parliament. So we'll find out in a few hours' time as the results start coming in. But it's similar to a UK election, a first past the post system. There's no campaigning today. Obviously, we've had that terrible attack in Vancouver, which sort of disrupted the last days of campaigning. But it's looking like Mark Carney is going to get over the line and stay in as Prime Minister, which will be a remarkable story.
And I think it's remarkable, Dan, because this is the first international election that really is the test. Carney's folks painted Poilievre as a Trump wannabe. They pasted amazing ads next to each other, almost showing him speak exactly the same things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth. And we'll see, did that work? By branding somebody as Trump-like, are they going to lose? And so I'm really interested to see the results, especially as it comes to that and the Trump brand internationally. The other thing, Tom, you mentioned this whole 51st state talk. The Canadians, we're looking at a real downturn in tourism. And in America, we have about 20.4 million Canadians that come to visit every year. I'm from the state of Wisconsin. We border Canada. All of my relatives go up and they fish in Canada, and they have friends that come down from Canada. Those 20 million visitors a year pour $20 billion with a B dollars into the U.S. economy. So it's going to be very interesting as well to see the reaction of Canada. They're not liking all this 51st state talk. I think once it translates into an economic disruption for the United States, that's where it's going to carry more weight.
Laura, why do you think that the sort of White House team, Susie Wiles and others, are not able to sort of control the Trump tweets on the 51st state? I mean, it seems so counterproductive. It seems, as Dan alluded to there, that it's almost certainly just strengthening his obvious sort of opponent, namely the Liberal Party. Do you think that Susie Wiles has lost control and her famed discipline of the White House is already over 100 days in?
Yeah, I think Susie Wiles is like picking her battles. What can she control Trump with it and what she can't. And I think right now her frontline battle, especially according to the new polling that's just come out in the first 100 days, we've really gone from excitement to unpredictability. And I think that unpredictability in the market is what's driving Trump's numbers down. Right now, 60% of America says we're on the wrong track. So I think that she's just picking her battles because she's been allowing the Treasury Secretary to be the last one in the room versus another advisor that's pro-tariff. So you have one that's a little bit more reasonable on it. So I think she's just picking her battles.
Maybe I could just jump in there briefly, a quick anecdote from the front line of the restaurant that we ate in last night. And there was a family eating on the table next to us, and they were going to order. They said they liked Californian wine, and they were going to order Californian wine, but because of the current situation, they weren't. And that for me kind of was just this little kind of window into Canadian psychology at the moment. They are avoiding American products. You go into a supermarket and it's labeled, this, American or Canadian, and people are actively avoiding any, not only buying American products but going on holiday to America. It's quite incredible the resolve that is being built up against America here in Canada.
We probably better move to a close here. So I just ask you for a final thought in a moment. it seems to me, again, looking at it from this side of the Atlantic, and very carefully looking at all the polling, and there's a CBS poll out, obviously, this week that has quite a lot of detail in it. Again, it feels like people voted for Trump with quite high hopes on the economy, quite high hopes on inflation, quite high hopes there would be a drastic change on immigration. And there are some things that again, looking at the data, people feel are going the way they wanted. They quite like the fact that, as far as I understand it, that he's being tough on immigration. But again, according to the data that I was looking at, it feels like they don't like it when it starts to stray into potentially talk of deporting US citizens, overseas, or even detaining people illegally. All that begins to make people uncomfortable. And certainly on the overall approval ratings and on the economy, sure, the MAGA base is staying pretty loyal, but an awful lot of others are really not enjoying it, and not enjoying tariffs, and not enjoying the way he's handling the economy. So it seems to me that he came in very bullish, feeling he could do anything. And already we've seen signs that he can't do anything he wants. And, the backtracking on tariffs and all the rest of it appears to be a reflection of that. And, to go back to what we were talking about at the start about 2028, well, that's a troll that only really works, I would argue, if you sort of feel that Trump's so immensely popular that they could contemplate the idea of doing something quite transgressive and getting away with it. Whereas if Trump is pretty unpopular, then it's hard to see how that could possibly fly. But I just wanted to ask you, to wind up maybe by, Laura, maybe you go first, by would you dare to make a prediction about the next 100 days and how it might go? Or more specifically, how you think the next 100 days differs, if at all, from the first 100 days?
Well, the next 100 days, it's going to get real. It's going to get real for the Trump administration, because it's going to move from the executive orders and the court battles to, Trump always wants to win on appeal. So we're going to see a lot of results from those executive orders coming out. But we're also going into a session with Congress where they have to pass a budget. And the Treasury Department this week is going to come out and say basically when the debt limit will be exceeded. And it's going to put pressure on to get a reconciliation bill. And that's something that the Speaker of the House is down talking to the president about today. They may have cuts to Medicaid. They may have cuts to Social Security. How will the Republicans in Congress be able to stomach that in order to pay for all the tax cuts and the other things Trump wanted to put into place? So I think this is where it gets real, because Congress has to put that package together. They've got to get the votes to pass it. And, like to Robert's point, just talking about 28, Trump's most likely not running again. But guess what? All those Republicans in Congress are. And in the last few months, when there have been state elections, they've gone to the Democrats. And right now, it looks like a midterm election next year would possibly go to the Democrats. So this is where it's not just covering his own backside, but it's the Republicans in Congress trying to figure out how they can cover theirs while still pleasing the president. That negotiation this summer on the budget is really going to be where it gets real.
Yeah, I think Laura's right, and the kind of chickens coming home to roost in terms of prices, inflation here, but also just in terms of shortages. I mean, we've seen stories about sort of half-empty ships leaving China, heading to the US, because Chinese manufacturers have decided just not to send stuff because of the tariff situation. I saw a table online of prices that one big Chinese manufacturer was putting out, with enormous increases in things like bath towels, for example, increasing threefold in price. So I think a lot of that economic pain is yet to come, and that will feed through to real Americans who will start to wonder, hang on, what on earth is going on here? Either I can't buy the things I want to, or they're exorbitantly expensive. So there is going to be some economic pain and some economic chickens coming home to roost. And, if his approval rating is bad now, then, I think we can expect it might get even worse.
Yeah, excellent point, Dan. I mean, that issue of, and Laura as well, both make excellent points about how the supply chain, issue, that is going to be potentially the story of the next 100 days. You can cause disruption with those tariffs. on day one, but you're only going to see the impact perhaps over the next 3 months or so. Look, I'm going to be watching that. I'm going to be watching Ukraine. Can he pull off a ceasefire, however sort of compromised it is in terms of whether he swallows the Russian narrative? I mean, that is such a critical issue in terms of whether kind of Europe can move forward beyond that conflict. I'm watching the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, wondering really if that sort of strangulation of innocent Palestinians is going to continue. So there's so many issues that are in Donald Trump's in tray. And I think the other great issue is one I mentioned earlier. Can he, against the odds, sort of hit and strike, unilateral or bilateral trade deals with some of the big nations of the world to try and get trade flowing again? So all of those are big issues. All of those will shape essentially the next 18 months of Donald Trump's America, and perhaps determine who wins Congress in 2026.
Well, thank you all so much. That is sadly all we have time for this week. We'll be back next week on Bank Holiday Monday with another USA Q&A. So do please keep your questions coming to talkingpolitics@itv.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, from all of us here on Talking Politics USA, goodbye.